Welcome to the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. I'm Mickey Huff.
Oh, dramatic pause. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and we are your co-hosts of the Project Censored radio show. And we don't usually do this together, which is why I let that dramatic pause hang there, Mickey.
Beautiful. So it's fun to be doing a show with you together, and it is an absolutely important, essential topic. And we have two folks from the Freedom of the Press Foundation with us today, Lauren Harper and Seth Stern. Eleanor, would you kindly please introduce our esteemed guest?
Absolutely. So Seth Stern is the director of advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation. And prior to joining FPF, Seth practiced media and First Amendment law in Chicago for over a decade. And before that, he worked as a reporter and editor in Chicago and Atlanta. And Lauren Harper is Freedom of the Press Foundation's first Daniel Ellsberg chair on government secrecy, a position she comes to after a decade fighting excessive government secrecy with Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, the National Security Archive. There, she served as public policy director and helped historians, journalists, and the public win the declassification of historically significant government documents. Seth and Lauren, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Our
Great to be with
pleasure.
you.
So I want to start off here with a recent article that you wrote, Seth, for The Intercept, though I'm going to be honest, when I read the headline, I was like, that's The Onion. The headline reads, "The feds want to make it illegal to even possess an anarchist zine." And this is referring to a Dallas-based artist who wasn't even present at a demonstration, which feels to me very Haymarket Affair, where several people arrested weren't even at the Haymarket Affair. So history does, if nothing else, rhyme. So this Dallas-based artist is being accused of transporting a box that contained, quote, Antifa materials, in this case, zines and pamphlets. So, Seth, whether we want to or not, can you take us down this absurd rabbit hole of this extraordinary case?
Yeah, and I'll start with an update after my article. I don't know if you saw this in The Intercept. I didn't write it, but they reported it. The artist was accidentally released from prison temporarily before he had to turn himself back in
What?
because it was an inadvertent release, best and brightest. But anyhow, so the artist name is Daniel Sanchez. He goes by Dez. His wife, who is also an activist, attended a protest outside an ICE facility in Texas called the Prairie Land Facility. It was a noise demonstration. People were lighting off fireworks and essentially, making noise. Um, Things got hostile. Local police showed up on the scene. Allegedly, one of the officers who showed up was shot. Some people I've spoken to have doubts as to whether the officer was in fact shot with a gun or hit with a firework, given that he was shot, they say, in the neck and then released from the hospital after a few hours, which seems like, I'm no doctor. But regardless, perhaps he was shot with a gun. There were shell casings found on the scene. People did have guns. It's entirely possible, even likely. But it was one shot that hit him. There was one shooter. 20 people were arrested on various charges of being somehow complicit when all they had done, or all they're really alleged to have done, is go to a protest and exercise their rights. Reminiscent of what happened with the Cop City case in Atlanta, where a few people involved in the Stop Cop City movement had allegedly broken the law, whether it be arson, vandalism. The severity of the offense doesn't really matter, except for that one person. For everyone else, what mattered was they were charged with a RICO conspiracy of being connected to these isolated offenders just by being part of the same movement, by distributing the same literature, by talking to the press, by communicating and organizing activism. So we're seeing more of that. Where this went even further was with Des, who was also indicted and charged, even though he was not present at the protest. The reason he was charged is that he and his wife had some anarchist zines, pamphlets, um, political essays, none of them having anything to do with the events that happened at the protest in question. They're just, think pieces, essentially. Um, and he took them from their home to someone else's apartment. I'm not sure if it was a friend or colleague or, whatever. He took them somewhere else. And the authorities are alleging that he took them somewhere else to conceal evidence because he knew they would incriminate his wife. Incriminate his wife in what is the question? In possession of anarchist literature? That's not a crime. Um, to the extent, as I said in the article, that Des was concerned that the literature would be used against his wife in court. That isn't a comment on Des or his wife doing anything wrong. That is a comment on the condition that free speech and the First Amendment are in the country. And if that was what he attempted to do, well, now we see why, because he was in fact right. The authorities do consider mere possession of political literature to be incriminating material.
Well, Seth Stern, how is that actually possible legally? I mean, quite frankly, I don't even mean to be facetious, although, as Eleanor said earlier, it reads like an Onion article in some places. Seditious literature. I mean, we're back to that. I mean, are we back to, throwing people in prison for 10 years for standing on a soapbox and telling workers not to join the movement? Where are we, Seth Stern?
Well, right. No, it's not possible legally, in the abstract. As with everything else these days, we can talk about what's possible legally, assuming that we have a functional legal system, but perhaps we don't. There is certainly a constitutional right to have anarchist literature and move it as you see fit. The founders weren't exactly timid about controversial ideas and revolution, and I don't want to prop up the founders on a pedestal. Obviously, they were awful in plenty of ways, but one thing that's for sure is they were okay with anarchist literature, well, not necessarily anarchist, but controversial literature. That was
They were,
exactly what they intended to protect with freedom of the press.
weren't they
It
writing their own
documents
seditious
that
literature?
right, documents that promote revolution. So there's not really any legal case to be made, but what we have going on is this effort to define Antifa, anti-fascism, an ideology as a terrorist organization and then deem anything that furthers anti-fascist objectives as support of that organization. So that's the legal hook that the administration is using in Dez's case and in so many others, similar to how it has determined that essentially any pro-Palestine thought is support of Hamas, um, ranging from questioning whether the Holy Land Five were properly convicted to writing an op-ed that, like Ramisa Öztürk did, that is critical of Israel and calls for a boycott. And I'm referring to the case of Yakub Vihandre with the Holy Land Five, where they've taken the position that his questioning whether they were wrongly convicted is supportive of their actions. If he doesn't believe they did the things they are accused of, how is he exactly supporting them by supporting the things that he doesn't think happened in the first place? It's like saying if I say OJ didn't do it, I'm supporting spouse murder. No, no, that's not really how it works. It's the opposite. But anyway, that's the vague legal hook they're using, something or other to do with Antifa. Essentially, just scream it in the air like magic words, and the First Amendment goes away. I don't want to dignify it by trying to analyze it any further than that.
And I feel like a lot of this is, I mean, it's extra legal in the sense that, so recently Ken Klippenstein reported on a Justice Department memo where Pam Bondi is ordering the FBI to, quote, compile a list of groups or entities engaging in acts that may constitute domestic terrorism, end quote. The target is those expressing, quote, opposition to law and immigration enforcement, extreme views in favor of mass migration and open borders, adherence to radical gender ideology, anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, end quote. So I've got like 10 minutes to leave the country. But I mean, I feel like this seems absurd, but part of the objective, just like COINTELPRO or any of these projects, is not necessarily to work within the legal system. It's just to try and scare people, to try to harass people from exercising their First Amendment rights.
Well, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one that wasn't in that list, but that was in the criminal complaint against Des is anti-Trumpism.
Mhm.
The literature he possessed was anti-government and anti-Trump. That's in an indictment. You can't criticize the president. Absolutely, this is intended not only to punish individuals, but to chill the free speech of plenty of others. For every one person you punish, you silence countless others. We don't know how many student op-eds were not printed because of what happened to Rumi Sousturk. We don't know how many protests won't happen because of what's going on with the Prairie Land folks. And of course, Dez's case is what we're focused on because of its implications for the press and just because of its absurdity. But his wife, who also isn't accused of anything, is facing a life sentence. So that's quite chilling. The people are very brave in fighting authoritarianism, but most of us do not want to spend our lives in prison. And that prospect, even for the best of us, is going to have some impact on how we go about our activism.
Well, chilling effect is a real situation, both historically and in the present, and even anecdotally. I do know, unfortunately, a number of people who have decided either to not be more public about certain things they're doing, or people that have worked with us in the past that have asked about, hey, do we need to still be affiliated in the history of the big internet things? uh, things like people did maybe that were student work or other things of that nature. I mean, this is a very real conundrum. I mean, that word doesn't do it justice. Could we just say real quickly, and I want to go to Lauren Harper. Could we say quickly one time out loud that Antifa is not an organization, does not have a leader or a headquarters?
Yes.
Yeah,
Let's say it
okay,
out loud. Yeah.
there you go, Lauren. So take it from there, Lauren.
I think one of the things that is a theme here, and Eleanor mentioned this, it's applying this veneer of legality to things that are not legal. She was discussing the Justice Department memo basically applying these extremely broad and vague terms to cover whatever the Trump administration wants it to apply to. And the thing that it made me think of, it's not quite a First Amendment issue, but we saw this at the beginning of the administration when the Trump administration used the Alien Enemies Act to wrongly deport Venezuelans to El Salvador. They are applying these terms that are, legal terms, but they are not appropriate to the situations that they are applying them to. And they are continuing to bulldoze their way through these legal and military operations by continuing to rely on these terms. So I think that's one of the big problems here is particularly in the national security space is that things like harm to national defense are not narrowly defined. It's never been. And that's been a problem that multiple congressional committees have looked at as far back as the Moynihan Commission in the mid 90s, where they recommended let's narrow these definitions so these terms cannot be so broadly abused. That was something that was recommended even a couple of years ago in a Senate Homeland Security bill, if I remember correctly, that basically said, look, if we want to reduce overclassification, we need to define these terms. And not only would defining them reduce classification, it would overclassification. It would make it more difficult to basically use national security as an excuse to do whatever you'd like to do because the terms currently are so broad that it effectively allows the Justice Department and a whole swath of other agencies to say, hey, this is in defense of national security. We're going to go ahead and do it. And historically, courts and Congress have been really reluctant to intervene in the national security space. And I think it's time for them to do so.
Lauren, I kind of wanted to piggyback on what you were just talking about because there's another aspect of this secrecy and, oh, it's in the defense of Homeland Security, which again is just like kind of a blanket statement you can say about anything. And FPF has also noted that ICE is targeting journalists who try to cover what ICE is doing, which incidentally is breaking the law and being horrific in so many ways. And you also covered that journalists have in fact been thrown out of courtrooms for, quote, not having the right kind of permission to cover immigration proceedings, which that right kind of permission seems to me like it would be the First Amendment. But is this another example of that? Oh, well, this has to do with Homeland Security, so you can't watch these immigration proceedings? Or is this just, they're not even saying that? Like, is this not even a secrecy problem? It's just, hey, we can do it. No one's going to hold us accountable.
It's absolutely a secrecy problem. I'm sure Seth has some stuff to add here too, but to me, what's happening at DHS, and it's most visible with ICE, is DHS is trying to become a domestic intelligence agency. It is effectively a domestic surveillance agency. And it's taking a lot of tactics that we've seen the Defense Department and agencies within the intelligence community to make their operations more secretive, whether that's targeting journalists or people that are being detained. And it's doing this through a number of ways. At the end of the first Trump administration, both CBP, Customs and Border Patrol or Protection, and ICE were both given security agency designation or status. And this is something that you typically see within the intelligence community. And what this does is it makes it more difficult through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, et cetera, to get more details about ICE officer or immigration officer names, salaries, job titles, all this kind of thing. And this is a big deal because it makes it a lot more difficult to hold individual officers accountable. This gets even more difficult when we remember that at the beginning of this Trump administration, Trump rescinded a Biden era executive order requiring all federal law enforcement to wear body camera footage. This was something that we've seen the DEA walk back, and I think we will see other agencies walk back as well. ICE and CBP and other agencies do occasionally wear cameras, but all of these moves are designed to make it more difficult to hold these immigration officials accountable. And it makes it easier for immigration and DHS officials to target the most vulnerable, including journalists who are not citizens. But another big area where ICE is secretive beyond any need is the private prison system that ICE and DHS relies on is not subject to FOIA. It's not subject to really any effective oversight. And this allows DHS and their contractors to make money off of kidnapping and terrorizing these people and shuttling them through this secretive system where there is no oversight by the public and there's increasingly little oversight by members of Congress because ICE is also restricting congressional oversight. So I think really what we're seeing DHS writ large do is follow in the footsteps of intelligence community agencies who have made effective oversight by either the courts, Congress, or the public extremely difficult. And I think if we're looking ahead, let's assume that what I posit about DHS trying to basically act like an intel agency is correct. I think one of the concerns we have to look out for ahead is that ISIS and DHS overall is going to take a similar approach as the intelligence community when it comes to its budget and say this should also be classified because these things that we're doing are to protect national security. And this is a big problem because most of the stories that have broken about ISIS behavior have come through procurement data. And that is data that is required to be publicly posted so long as it's not classified. That's why we don't have any procurement data for the intelligence community agencies. So I think we need to keep our eyes open and proactively fight against arguments that DHS could make that would basically say, look, we also fall under, the national security blanket. We should also be able to be exempt from disclosing this kind of information that gives insight into our operations. But Seth, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add about ICE and journalists on top of that.
Seth Stern?
There I am. I'll just come back to Eleanor's comment about journalists being restricted from covering immigration proceedings, because that was actually a very strange and unusual experience that we had where we contacted an official from the Trump administration from the Executive Office of Immigration Review. And this is the weird part. They responded and fixed the problem, at least in part. So similar to earlier in the year when Lauren submitted a FOIA for records relating to the administration's claims that Venezuela's government was directing the actions of Tren de Aragua and got a very fast response, which effectively blew apart that narrative. There are apparently still some people who have managed to kind of slide under the radar who are in the administration attempting to do the right thing. Because when I wrote this letter to court personnel, it was actually local court personnel who I wrote to, but then they forwarded it to the EOIR. Um, the intention wasn't to get a response and have the administration jump right on it and make it right. That would be naive to expect. The intention is to get the no comment so that I can say I tried and proceed to next steps. But here it was a situation where a couple journalists in Maryland had been told that they are not allowed to cover immigration hearings without advance permission pursuant to an EOIR fact sheet that had been issued, and they were kicked out. And we looked at the fact sheet. The fact sheet didn't say that. It encouraged journalists to get advance permission, which is weird, but I guess not unconstitutional. You can encourage people to do whatever they want if they're free to ignore you. Um, so we alerted EOIR to that it was not required by their fact sheet, but there was another problematic provision in their fact sheet requiring journalists to check in when they actually arrive to cover hearings, which is something I had heard about where I live in Chicago as well. But I hadn't really been able to confirm that it was limited to journalists or to figure out what the deal was with that. But in fact, that was happening. They were requiring journalists to check in upon arrival. They claimed it was because journalists were entitled to priority seating, but make that optional then. If you're a journalist and you want your priority seating, you can go check in and say, I'd like my good seats, please. If you're a journalist who perhaps doesn't want to be on the administration's blacklist and would rather just walk into the courtroom and cover it from the regular seating, you should be able to do that, particularly in this climate. So EOIR actually did issue a new fact sheet that removed the mandatory check-in language and explained that it was a suggestion intended to facilitate the priority seating. And they let those two journalists back in and clarified that permission is not needed in advance to cover immigration hearings. And, we posted all that on our site, so any journalists who might confront officials at another court would know about it and would be able to print it out if they wanted and have it on their person. That does not by any means mean that the problems with ICE and journalists are over. Journalists in New York immigration courts have been repeatedly assaulted, harassed, had their press badges photographed by ICE agents, entirely inappropriate conduct. The rules in terms of photography in common spaces of ICE court facilities have been shifting back and forth with no apparent reason. And of course, journalists covering protests against ICE are finding themselves assaulted and occasionally arrested. And if they happen to be non-citizens, as in the case of Mario Guevara, deported. In Chicago, again, where I am, a journalist named Steve Held from Unraveled Press was arrested while covering a protest back in September. And he had an experience that he posted about on social media that I thought was really telling and kind of symbolic of the whole thing, where in his cell in the ICE detention center, apparently the agents recognized at some point we've got a journalist in our custody, and you know what journalists like to do? They like to report. So they went and taped up the windows of his cell. Um, so he had to peer through cracks in the tape in order to observe what ICE is doing. And if you read or listen to, for example, Sami Hamdi, a journalist, a British journalist who he wasn't covering ICE, he was on a speaking tour about Palestine, but he was detained by ICE nonetheless when they decided that they didn't want him in this country. spent 18 days in ICE detainment, and the conditions he described were absolutely atrocious, probably unfamiliar, probably familiar, I should say, to people who have been incarcerated in America's regular prison system, but nonetheless, um, quite disturbing, and perhaps having the ability to gain the attention of the public in ways that the longstanding abuses in the prison system at large won't. So ICE, I think, knows that that is a weakness for them. As much as they want to suppress coverage on the outside, I don't think they want the conditions in which they're holding people to get out. Whatever people might think about immigration enforcement, few people believe that someone deserves to be, tortured just for not having their papers right.
Lauren Harper, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the other thing that occurs to me is we're also seeing DHS Kristi Noem and DOJ AG Pam Bondi go after large media companies, specifically CNN, for reporting on an ICE tracking app called ICE Block. They threatened to prosecute CNN for this, which is ludicrous. FPF, we actually filed a series of FOIA requests about it. We haven't heard anything back, but it's something that we are pursuing. And then DOJ has also gone after apps, ICE tracking apps, the stores that house them, including Google and I believe Apple Store, to take down apps including ICE Block, Red Dot. I think there are a few others. And, does this involve jawboning or threatening these platforms? We're not entirely sure. But fortunately, Electronica Frontier Foundation, or EFF, recently filed a FOIA lawsuit the other week to try and get more information there. But they're really taking a beyond a multi-pronged approach to try and restrict not only access to information about what agencies are doing, but really trying to intimidate those who not only report on immigration officials, but those who within their own communities just want to know what immigration officials are doing. They're tightening the screws in all of those areas.
Well, yeah, and I wanted to ask a little bit about that because we're talking a lot about the legal aspect of the or the illegal aspects of this. And the saying that a right is only as good as the legal and social systems that protect and enforce it. And I mean, there are so many lawsuits being filed with regards to ICE and with regards to just a lot of things happening. So I'm curious, I mean, since this is y'all's wheelhouse far more than it is mine. um, could you talk a little about what you're seeing in the courts? I mean, do you feel that courts are doing a good job of upholding these rights, or are they kind of like, I'm just going to defer to ICE here, I'm going to defer to the DOJ or what have, like, what are we seeing in terms of the legal landscape right now?
Well,
Go ahead, Seth. Yeah.
the Supreme Court is in obviously awful shape, and we can go on about the Supreme Court forever, and that casts a great degree of uncertainty over anything that the lower courts might do, because at the end of the day, you've got this essentially corrupted, bought and sold collective of judges who can undo any good done beneath them as they see fit. So putting that sort of grim fact aside, it's hard to talk when you're getting to the lower court level. It's hard to talk about the courts as a collective because every judge is an individual at the trial court level. There is no necessarily it's difficult to spot trends, and that's why there's so much forum shopping. That's why we see lawsuits filed in the jurisdictions where people think they'll be most successful. There have been plenty of good rulings pushing back against the administration. What there hasn't been is people being held in contempt. And that I think is what's missing. In Chicago again, we had this great temporary restraining order and later an equally great preliminary injunction order entered by a judge, Sarah Ellis, to stop ICE's abuses of journalists and protesters, prohibiting dispersal of journalists along with protesters, prohibiting various categories of munitions that were being used against journalists and protesters, entered in very dramatic fashion quoting everyone from the founders to, Carl Sandburg's poems about Chicago. It was a whole production. But so what? Nobody was held accountable. Judges have the power to hold people in contempt for violating their orders. That can be a fine. It can also be imprisonment. You've got, Greg Bovino, who after court sessions was 5 minutes later, flashing tear gas canisters out the window of his SUV. The TRO, I won't say that it was entirely disregarded. Things did get marginally better after it was entered, but it was violated left and right, and nothing came of it. And across the judiciary, and also from attorney disciplinary commissions, every state has a state bar that has the power to discipline and disbar, suspend attorneys' law licenses. People need to get away from norms and mentalities that are a product of a bygone time. This deference and benefit of the doubt given to lawyers and particularly government lawyers that, hey, they may be making misguided arguments, they may have made mistakes, but they're trying to do the right thing, and we shouldn't hit them too hard. No, no, the government is coming to court and making a mockery of the system. It's lying left and right, making stuff up. A lawyer came into Chicago and told a Chicagoan judge that we are in the midst of a violent, organized terrorist invasion of the city. The courtroom broke out in laughter, as it should, because if you live here, that's absurd. But you shouldn't be able to go into a courtroom and make up a terrorist invasion. That I don't know exactly where the line should be drawn, but that seems like it is beyond it.
Seth just gave us some insight there. And Lauren, I wanted to bounce to you because I know you had some thoughts about that as well.
Well, I don't think I could say anything better than Seth did, but the thing that occurs to me, in addition to lawyers coming into court, government lawyers, and making claims that are facetious at best, we've also seen several incidents of ICE. It's one of the few agencies that has its own lawyers that represents itself, the agency in court, refuse to identify themselves, ostensibly out of security concerns, and the judges in the instances that I am aware have allowed it. And I think, that is such a low bar that we shouldn't have to argue about. Lawyers, particularly for the government, should identify themselves in court and they should be pressed on it. These claims that DHS and ICE officials are under attack are absolutely bogus, and nobody's pressing them, at least from the courts, about those claims when it's used as an excuse to withhold their identities. So that's an extremely, extremely low bar that we should not be seeing any more instances of this, but I'm sure we will continue to.
So, Lauren Harper, on that tip, I was wanting to ask about the separation, if there is any, but the local versus federal, and what we're seeing in places like New York or Los Angeles, where we, of course, see the local police working with ICE. Sometimes we see them not working with ICE. Um, I mean, I guess part of the strategy is to sow chaos. And you talked earlier, both you and Eleanor, and you mentioned providing how the government is providing the veneer of legality. And again, as Seth pointed out, just the egregious absurdity of the statements
Hmm.
that are being made, that whether it's Chicago or Portland or wherever, where are we legally with that? Actually, if legally means something in the real world, like where are we with can the NYPD stand up against ICE? How is it lawful for ICE to not identify themselves, park outside of people's schools, and rip parents out of cars?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question to answer in a blanket statement because individual, local police forces all behave differently. But what I will say, one of the broad problems that we are seeing, kind of reach an apex right now is this long-term militarization of local polices. A lot of the tools and resources that police forces have are from the military, and this has long been a problem. And I think
1033, War on
exact
Terror.
exactly. And now that we are seeing more and more sheriff's office, county sheriff's agencies, local police forces, et cetera, work with ICE, particularly in places like Texas, that is a compounding problem. I think, the 287, there's a 287G program, and this basically allows local law enforcement, local sheriff's office to participate in federal immigration enforcement. And you can participate at a variety of levels. There are some places like in Arizona that don't do full participation, as far as I'm aware, because there have been suits in the past basically saying that participating at the full level resulted in, a blanket racial bias. But the 287G program until this year was a voluntary program that did not have financial incentives. But now, with the passage of the big ugly bill, there is a financial incentive for local police forces to participate with the federal government in these immigration enforcement proceedings. So I don't think it's a question about, certainly it is important to state that like local police forces don't necessarily have to participate, but why would they not when they are getting financial incentives from ICE to participate? And I think the other thing that we're seeing is the draining of a lot of local law enforcement, as well as officials in prisons that are leaving these jobs that typically don't pay as well to go work for ICE because it pays better. So I think, overall, the balance of power is certainly in the federal government's favor, particularly when we take the financials into account. And I think Texas is probably the best state to look at because as Texas is trying to build, this is in the process of building this mammoth uh, private prison detention slash removal process, it is requiring that the local entities who participate be participants within the 287G program. And then those local agencies are working with private vendors to house and detain people and to shuttle them throughout the state, making it harder to really know where these people are. And ICE is effectively, it's orchestrating it, if you will, but it's taking itself almost out of the actual process. And by doing so, that makes oversight extremely difficult. So certainly, local police forces could opt to behave differently. But now in this environment, as we're seeing this boon of the immigration industrial complex, what incentive is there when these police forces have already showed a willingness to take federal money to beef up their own reserves for whatever purposes they might have?
Is this internal obstruction of ICE to not let people know what's happening? I mean, what's the legality of that? You mentioned earlier that it wasn't considered an intel org such that it could lay that claim. Now it's playing that way. How is it then again lawful, other than just someone saying so or pretending so, for them to do these things?
ICE for the time is, from what I have seen, including, being labeled a security agency, taking advantage of the fact that by working with private contractors, you can exploit these long-standing transparency problems. In some ways, it's not doing anything all that new. That's part of the problem with the Trump administration in general. A lot of these things, as an idea or a practice, they're not a new problem. Democratic and Republican administrations have both engaged to varying degrees of similar types of behavior. But what we're seeing with the Trump administration is the realization, I think, after this first term, norms and even these gray areas, nobody is going to apply the pressure to actually close these gaps. So why not just put the foot on the gas and go full speed on all directions? And that's exactly what it's doing. So in terms of the way that it is concealing some of this information, yes, it is within the bounds of the law, but there are other things that ICE is doing that is not. For example, Congress has the right to inspect detention facilities without any notice whatsoever. So ICE basically playing this shell game of like, no, you need to give us 24 hours notice, need to give us 48 hours notice, 72 hours notice. All of that is bogus. So I think we're really seeing the combination of both things and really an agency that's taken advantage of the fact that a lot of the intricacies of the law are not super well known, including by members of Congress and perhaps even by police forces and stuff like that. And they're also taking advantage of, I think national security is in some ways it's a really effective rallying cry to win public support. I think it's always been like that. And I think one of the things that the election of Trump, not once but twice, shows is that, tying these things to immigration is really effective within certain pockets of certain states and things like that. And I think, Trump certainly knows, and I think more and more officials are starting to realize this, that in some ways PR is more powerful than the law. especially when you're not super concerned that courts or Congress are going to rein you in. And I think they're absolutely running with that as far and as fast as they can. How long that'll last, that remains to be seen.
Which is why they've hijacked the FCC and they're allowing all these large pro-Trump right-wing mergers to control the message, to control the PR. It seems like full speed fascism. So why wouldn't being against fascism be a crime? Eleanor, over to you.
Yeah, amen. And I wanted to kind of continue this thread of using the law as a bludgeon for perhaps the anti-fascists of the world. And FPF has covered the plethora of SLAPP lawsuits. For folks who don't know, that's the strategic lawsuit against public participation. And I first came across SLAPP lawsuits when I was working in environmental protection. But this is a way to silence truth tellers. And there's a new initiative that y'all mentioned in a post that's been put on by the First Amendment Watch called the SLAPP Back Initiative, which aims to track all these SLAPP lawsuits in the U.S. And I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about that and what are SLAPP lawsuits used for with regards to the First Amendment?
Sure, and correct. Our friends at First Amendment Watch have launched this new tracker that will grow with time, but it is intended to create a record so that we can, as we do with the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, Freedom of the Press Foundation, when it comes to journalist arrests, assaults, subpoenas, prior restraints, to be able to document year by year, state by state where SLAPP suits are being filed, not only against journalists, but as you say, against activists, environmental and otherwise, and anyone else, local people who try to call attention to government misconduct. Um, but Trump is perhaps the world's most prolific filer of SLAPP suits, at least among world leaders. That goes without saying, possibly among all 8 billion folks on the planet. It's really gotten to a point. I think anyone else who files the number of frivolous lawsuits that Trump files would find themselves on what is called a restricted filers list. And I'm not saying that that's a good practice or not. I have my own First Amendment concerns about whether restricted filers lists should exist. But most courts in the country have that list of just people who have filed so many blatantly frivolous, retaliatory, incoherent lawsuits that their filings get an initial layer of screening before they are allowed to go in front of a judge. If Trump was my neighbor and not the president of the United States, I have no doubt that he would have earned a place at the top of one of those lists. He has said before his current term, that he files these lawsuits knowing it doesn't matter if he wins, but that it's going to cost his opponent a lot of money and it's only going to cost him a little. He's made his agenda clear, and that's the definition of a SLAPP suit. You're filing it not to win, not to seek redress for actual damage that you have suffered, but to punish somebody, to bleed them dry with legal fees. And we're seeing him do that repeatedly. He did that with ABC, with the George Stephanopoulos case, when the debate was Stephanopoulos had said he was found liable for rape when in fact he'd been found liable for sexual abuse. What Stephanopoulos should have done was spelled out exactly what he was found liable for doing and see whether the semantics matter once people hear exactly what it was. But putting that aside, he's done that with Paramount, where he extracted the $16 million settlement, taking advantage of their vulnerability because they had a merger in front of the FCC over their fairly routine edit of an interview with Vice President Harris at the time, where she gave a pretty awful, incoherent answer about what she planned to do about Gaza should she be president, and they made her answer equally awful but somewhat less incoherent through their editing. And that apparently somehow cost Donald Trump $16 million in election interference damages in an election he won anyway. So, go figure. Recently Trump has sued the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, always seeking damages in the billions, based on the flimsiest of allegations. it's a tactic that he has found to be effective, especially with media outlets again capitulating. Now we're seeing the New York Times suing over the Pentagon access policy. Hopefully, other outlets will be more aggressive in defending themselves against these slap suits. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have not settled. The BBC, it sounds like, will apologize, but so far has not settled, and I don't know that they can settle given how that they're funded. I haven't brushed up on the intricacies of all of that. Um, but that's not going to stop. And when Trump doesn't file a lawsuit, he's going to get Brendan Carr, his FCC commissioner, to issue frivolous letters and threats and investigations. So it's all part of the same picture, this effort to make it, if not impossible, if not illegal, then very expensive to criticize Trump and his policies.
Lauren, was there anything that you wanted to add about slap suits?
No, Seth did a great job as always talking about them.
Well, and so I guess my follow-up question to that then is if somebody gets hit with a slap suit and they're not the New York Times, so they don't have, more money than God, what is the deal with that time once you get hit with that suit and your ability to practice protected First Amendment speech or press? What does that look like once you've been hit with that suit?
Well, it depends where you're sued. Many states have anti-SLAPP laws, which are laws that allow defendants who are sued, who are hit with a SLAPP suit, to seek an early dismissal of the suit before discovery, which is where litigation gets really expensive. If they lose that motion, immediately appeal it rather than having to wait until the end of trial after they've spent a bunch more money. And if they actually do get the suit dismissed pursuant to the anti-SLAPP law, to recover their attorney's fees. So that is about as powerful a weapon as civil law can provide a defendant to fight back against an anti-SLAPP suit, but it's still pretty expensive to get there. Sure, you get your attorney's fees at the end if you win, but what if you don't? Again, like I was saying before, every judge is different, and a lot of them aren't that good at their jobs, and you might just draw a bad judge who doesn't grant an anti-SLAPP motion that they should, and then the case proceeds, and you've got a lot of money to spend. So what needs to happen, and I'll get back to what I said before, is in addition to this remedy of anti-SLAPP motions where the defendant has to drive the bus, courts need to be stepping in and sanctioning frivolous filings. Disciplinary commissions need to be stepping in and disciplining attorneys that file pleadings with no basis in fact or law. Then there's the whole other problem that not all states have anti-SLAPP laws. And federal courts vary in terms of whether they will enforce state anti-SLAPP law in a federal court that sits in that state. Florida federal courts will enforce anti-SLAPP laws and hear anti-SLAPP motions under Florida's anti-SLAPP law. Texas courts won't. They say this lawsuit's pending in federal court, that's state law, nothing to do with us. So litigants are able to forum shop to get around anti-SLAPP laws in that sense. There is a pending federal anti-SLAPP bill that was introduced by Jamie Raskin in the House and Ron Wyden in the Senate. But until a Republican gets on board with it, it's not going to go anywhere in Congress. And at the federal level, that's not happening. And that's unfortunate because red states have anti-SLAPP laws. The Republican Party is not opposed to anti-SLAPP laws at the state level, not because they're great believers in the First Amendment, neither are the Democrats, but because they see that it could the cost benefit of it. Anybody can be hit with a SLAPP suit, regardless of politics. But at the federal level, under the Trump administration, at least, there is no support on the right for an anti-SLAPP law.
That's again pretty amazing overall, Seth Stern. I wanted to, I know, Eleanor, unless you had a follow-up to the follow-up, I wanted to ask another question, maybe for Lauren, or at least bring up another topic in the great grab bag of atrocities that we see being unveiled from the current administration. And this would be another legal incident, but this one stemming more to international affairs and the blatant attacks on boats off the coast of Venezuela, the claiming that these are drug boats without any evidence, the clear violation of due process. I bring it up. I bring it up because I know that you recently have written about this, Lauren. Can you bring people up to speed a little bit about what Senator Mark Kelly is talking about, the latest attacks on him, and how this is yet another sort of another example in this playbook of the Trump administration to skirt the law, obfuscate it, completely ignore it, all of the above.
Sure. So to date, the administration has conducted attacks on boats that are alleged to have been carrying drugs. And I think we are at a death toll of around 87 for this. But to date, the administration, one, has not released its legal rationale for conducting these strikes and hasn't released any other kind of records or communications or correspondence about them, including video, etc. So on the one hand, this problem of one, secret legal justifications, again, is not a new problem. These are authored by the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, and these are called OLC memos or opinions, and they have long been, for the most part, secret. And the easiest way to think about this is effectively secret law. So there have been pushes by the open government community and others for decades to basically prevent the OLC from issuing secret law in the first place, because why do we have it? And if you have to issue, if you're the Justice Department and you have to issue a classified legal opinion, there is nothing preventing you from issuing a complementary unclassified version of it so the public can get an idea of what is being legislative and what is effectively law. So there have been pushes for this that the Justice Department and every administration, Democrat and Republican, has resisted this. So this is worth saying, just as a point of fact. This is not just a Trump administration problem. But the reason that it is so egregious here and why it's so easy for so many of us to see how egregious it is because the administration is using these strikes, I would argue, as a PR tool and are not even backing down from the necessity of these for the defense of national security, which again, there's no firm definition of, to kill not only people at sea, but people who have survived these initial strikes. And so Senator Mark Kelly, who is among other things, he's on the Intelligence Committee, he's also on the Senate Armed Services Committee, has seen this classified legal memo from the Justice Department. And he said there's nothing about it that should be classified. I applaud him for saying that. It's absolutely true. But one of the things that I think we need to be honest about is the Trump administration is not going to release it on its own. FPF has filed a FOIA request for this. I know other entities have as well. It'll probably have to go to court. And even that may be very difficult because courts, for the most part, are very deferential to national security claims. And I imagine you could see that playing out here as well. But one of the things that Senator Kelly could do, as well as any other member of Congress, if they have a copy of the document, is to read it into the congressional record. Obviously, this happened most famously with Senator Mike Gravel, who read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record 54 years ago in 1971, relying on legislative immunity to do so. There is nothing stopping Senator Kelly from doing this. Not only does he have legislative immunity, but classification, as a point of fact, you cannot rely on classification to conceal wrongdoing or prevent embarrassment. There is also in the executive order on classification a provision that explicitly states even if this information is properly classified, which I think is debatable, it can be declassified if it's in the public interest for it to be declassified. I cannot think of a better example in this administration of something that, even if it is classified, ought to be declassified in the public interest. And if the Trump administration won't do it, which I don't think it will, it's up to a member of Congress with courage and conscience, I think, to read that into the congressional record so the public can read and hear the secret law that is dictating such a controversial and frankly blatantly illegal act that is being taken repeatedly with hubris and cruelty by this administration.
Lauren Harper, you are the first Dan Ellsberg chair on government secrecy at Freedom of the Press Foundation. You just referenced the Pentagon Papers, Mike Gravel. And in this case, in particular, it's a clear call for what Daniel Ellsberg called civil courage,
Hmm.
and how we need people from inside government and inside these agencies and inside the military to literally blow the whistle, to literally, at the risk of sounding cliche, quote, do the right thing in this case and come out and out this. I mean, it appears to be demonstrably unlawful. Many of the things that the administration is doing that you've talked about, that you and Seth Stern have talked about. Seth, a couple minutes left here, and Lauren, if you want to chime in too. Um, what can our listeners do? What can everyday people do that aren't in the legal trenches and that aren't experts on these matters? And as you said, the media PR blitz makes it, obfuscates it even more and equivocates relentlessly. The equivalent of Orwell's 2 and 2 = 5. The final command of the party was to not trust your own eyes and ears kind of moment that we're in here. So, Lauren, do you want to jump in? Then Seth, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. The one thing, I hate to talk about Epstein with only a few minutes left, but the one thing the Epstein files declassification bill shows, even though the bill's not perfect, it's a good bill, but, will we actually see the files? I'm guessing we're not going to see a lot of them. But it shows that Congress responds to public pressure on transparency. So I think one of the things that individuals can do is to continue to let their members of Congress know that they care about this stuff. And I know I'm probably a cynic. I know that that doesn't feel like the most powerful thing that you can do, but Congress, when it gets it past a threshold of a certain number of inquiries about something, it does respond. So, I will plug that FPF has an action center for a couple of these issues that makes it really easy for people to send a pre-written letter to Congress that they can alter about any one of these issues that we've come up with today. You certainly don't have to use that format, but reach out to your member of Congress because enough public pressure can compel them to act.
I would say the same, but extend it beyond members of Congress. For example, we were talking about what local police can do to rein in ICE. In Broadview, where the detention facility outside of Chicago is located, the police chief issued a great statement about how they were going to investigate ICE's misconduct, particularly a shooting of a CBS journalist. The Illinois State Police said they would too. Did they? I haven't heard any updates. And I saw Broadview Police and Illinois State Police both helping ICE police protests and arrest protesters, relegate protesters to George W. Bush era First Amendment zones, um, all the while freeing up ICE to spend its time abducting our neighbors instead of dealing with dissent. So when police make statements like that, hold them accountable for it. If you don't mean it, don't open your mouths. We're not going to tolerate theater. As we were discussing, the Trump administration is very much dependent on theater. Don't tolerate theater from its opponents either. The Minnesota police chief, who I don't know the first thing about, maybe he means it, Brian O'Hara, he just he instructed his officers to hold ICE agents accountable for abuses. They have the authority to do that. You can arrest an ICE agent for for assaulting somebody, for breaking the law. When you're in a federal building like an immigration courthouse, that's a bit different jurisdictionally. But on city streets, there are powers local law enforcement has. Use them. And if Mr. O'Hara doesn't follow through on that statement, let's not give him any credit for running his mouth and saying the right things. Let's see if he does the right things. Beyond that, holding officials accountable, whether in Congress or locally, of course, I'll always say support good journalism, whether it be your local newspaper or an outlet that is covering the issues that the corporate press doesn't at the national level. And even beyond supporting it financially, contribute, write letters to the editor, pitch op-eds, engage on social media, add your voice.
Yeah, amen. I'm a big proponent of citizen journalism. So Seth Stern, Lauren Harper, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us in this 1 hour roundtable discussion. Folks, do check out freedom.press. It's a great resource and also just a great way to engage with your First Amendment rights in a new and exciting way in these times. So Lauren and Seth, thank you so much for sitting down with us today. And Mickey, thanks for co-hosting with me on this unusual time.
My pleasure.
Thank you.